Well, when I was back here for the opening of Shark Fest, I was talking to people, and I mentioned that I give a talk on specifically how to search for giant meg teeth. And it's actually, there are some psychological and some straightforward mechanical aspects of finding a big meg tooth. And so we'll talk about those. We'll also talk about ways to make sure your friends you're collecting with don't collect big meg teeth. There'll be some psychology involved in that as well. So just brief background, what I do, I'm a paleobiologist. My job is to take fossils that we have and reconstruct lifestyles for those animals. Everybody asks me about meg. And when you say, oh, giant sharks, they will meg. So, there we go. So as some of you know, those of you who were here when I talked last time, all of those by one definition are giant sharks. And there's some of them that are far rarer than megs. People are asking me after I talked last time, well, how many megs have you collected? And I thought, oh yeah, 300-400. We actually went back and checked my collecting records, it's about 1,000. And there are sharks on here. For example, here's the giant threshers. I've collected 2 of those and actually go looking for them. Here's Paratotus. I've collected 3 of those and I actually go looking for those, and I find megs instead. Actually, for about the last 8 years, most of my meg research has been on fetal and neonatal and juvenile individuals. I collect 1 or 2 of those every trip. So one thing we're talking about is developing a search image. Search image is what predators use to spot prey that are hidden. So we're going to talk about how to develop a search image for looking for big megs. Okay? So, and I'm also going to tell you that this, some of you know this tooth is on the cover of Fossil Sharks Chesapeake Bay Region. There's actually a really good story about collecting big megs associated with that tooth, so I'll talk to you about that too. So what I want to do first, I just want to briefly review the basics of collecting shark's teeth on a beach. Now, there's other places you collect. You can dive for them. You can look for them in inland sites. Most people collect them on the beach. I want to talk about the basics because you're going to use that to your advantage if you're collecting with other people. Okay? It's called misdirection. Okay? So here's a beach. And one of the things you should notice that's important, it's going to be critical, most of the big material is down here, and as you go up the beach, the material gets finer. And that's through a process called winnowing. In an aesthetic mythological sense, winnowing is the separation of particles on a beach by moving water. It's separated by size. Now, what's important about that is if you're looking for something really big, you don't want to be looking up on the beach where you got real fine sand. Winnowing is not going to move them up there. And so winnowing is going to be fundamental to understanding how we select maybe 5 to 10% of the beach is going to produce 90, 95% of the big megs. And if you're on a beach a mile long, the bulk of the big megs are going to be in an area maybe this size of this room or twice the size of this room out of that mile. And what we'll talk about is how to find those areas. And winnowing is going to be part of that. Okay, so here's just a section of a beach, a fossil beach. So the fossils are coming out of the cliff here. We have a fall or a slump. And most of you have probably seen this. You have a beach and you're going to have these shell ridges. There's a high tide break, shell ridges, wave zone, subtile break, and a shell flat, and sometimes a sandbar. If you're just out trying to find a bunch of teeth, best time to go is right as low tide turns and you have an incoming tide, and you're going to collect the wave zone here. That's where the bulk of the fossil teeth are going to show up. And so here's some of my students doing exactly that. Here's this bottom shell ridge. So as a wave breaks and washes up here, it washes through that shell ridge and drains back down. Teeth are really sleek and streamlined, so they come out first and leave all those pieces of broken shell and gravel behind. And so The teeth they're collecting are actually in this shell ridge, but as this waves break up and come out, they're collecting them right in here. Standard collecting technique for teeth. You can modify that. Here's that subtitle shell break, so you can reach down there and pull material up and throw it up and let the waves sort it. You'll notice through all of this, I'm inherently lazy. I let water do the work so I don't have to. Okay, now you can get scoops, pull material up and let the waves sort it, that's fine. And you can get slightly bigger things. Here's a nice Hostalis tooth. But it's not necessarily the most efficient way to do it. And you find some nice stuff. I mean, those are nice teeth. Who wouldn't like those teeth? Anybody that's here tonight would not. Okay? So here's the problem. We have two fundamental problems with Meg teeth. See if that's better. First of all, they're very rare. You're talking about a 6-inch Meg tooth, you're talking about 1/2 of 1% of all the Meg teeth out there. The other problem is they're very heavy. Now I brought a tooth in, I'm gonna pass it around. I want to demonstrate something with it. This tooth is named Maggie. The reason I use it, it's virtually indestructible. I had a student of mine who was looking at it in class and I passed it around. She dropped it on her foot. She missed 2 collecting trips because she couldn't walk. Okay, so don't drop this on your foot. Okay, this is a tough tooth. The problem with teeth as they get really big is an issue of scaling. And paleobiologists, like engineers, deal with scaling issues all the time. So what you're looking at here, here's the height in inches. The blue here is the scaling factor for surface area, and the orange is the scaling factor for weight. So the surface area we're talking about here, here's the tooth, it's on a beach, right? This is the surface area that's supporting it. And the weight is what is being supported. Now look, as teeth get really large, look how dramatically the weight increases compared to the surface area to support it. Now the outcome, let's say this is a nice tooth, and my wife couldn't be here tonight. She says, well, tell them how big this tooth is. Okay, it's 5.5 inches. I have 22 teeth larger. Okay, but it's indestructible, which is why I brought it. You put this on the beach, a wave comes in, it starts to break around it, and when the wave comes in, the force of the water in the wave actually pushes water through the sand and starts to resuspend it. And the wave then scours that sand underneath the teeth, and this tooth, and it starts to sink. In fact, the expression that describes it perfectly is like an anvil in a swamp. One of my students in my lab years ago compared 6-inch teeth and 2-inch teeth. 6-inch teeth only spent about 4% of their time either partially or fully exposed on the surface. That means they're spending the rest of that time fully buried. For 2-inch teeth, those numbers are 60 and 40. So a bigger a tooth is, the less often it's exposed. And so to find it, you have to be in the right place at the right time. So to find these teeth, we're going to have to be in the right places for collecting and the right conditions. And when those two come together, big teeth are actually pretty easy to find. Now, clarify point I've already said. Really big megs are rare. Consider all the megs that are out there. But truthfully, big megs are not all that rare compared to many other fossils. So they're certainly doable and you can do it. So I want to pass this tooth around. What I'd like to have you look at and say, wow, that's a 5.5-inch tooth. It's that big compared to my hand. Think about the weight compared to that surface area that's supporting it. The reason I want to pass this around. And don't drop it on your foot. Okay. So, to give you some numbers, this is from a trip I had with 9 high school teachers a few years ago. They collected 2.5 hours and collected 1,864 teeth. Now, if you think about it, and they're using the techniques of weight wash and that we just talked about, about it, that's a little over 200 teeth per teacher and about a little over 80 per hour. That's not bad. And if you look at them, most of them are like this. They're just sitting out here. Here's the wave wash. And they're just sitting out there, as a former colleague of mine used to say, glowing in the dark. You can't miss them. On that same trip, I collected 4 teeth. Actually, I collected 3 fragments of big megs and 1 whole tooth. Oops, sorry. There it is. It's not that big, nothing wrong with it. It actually weighed as much as the 6 biggest teeth my class collected. But remember, we have to be in the right places under the right conditions. If you notice the place here, I'm not out on that nice, beautiful sandy beach. There's grungy stuff here, indurated rock. And it's not really out there glowing in the dark. It's hard to see. And that's really kind of the message we're going to start off with. They're going to be there. They're not going to be in the places most people collect, and they're going to be hard to see. Okay? So we need the right places and the right conditions. Let's start talking about right places. So I'm going to talk about 3 different areas. You guys can tell me where this cliff is. This is Stratford Hall. First place you want to be, you have to be someplace that has big meg teeth. As they say, you can't hunt grizzly bears in Central Park. You've got to be in an area where there are big megs. Calvert Formation has a lot of really nice megs up about 5.5 inches. If you want anything bigger than that, you got to go eastover, which is up here. There's the eastover up there. So there'll be some nice big teeth here. The biggest ones are going to be up here. So you've got to be somewhere first that has big teeth in the fossil beds. For many years, I hunted in Lee Creek. And what we would do before we ever started collecting, we'd get to the top of a ridge, pull out a pair of binoculars, and look at all the hills around us to decide which ones were worth collecting. And it's the same thing here. You have to decide which cliffs are worth collecting. So northern end of Calvert Cliffs, you'll never get teeth as big as you will in the middle of Calvert Cliffs. At Stratford and that part of Virginia, you'll never get really big megs in areas that doesn't have any eastover. You'll get some nice big teeth, but you're not going to get a 6-incher or rarely get a 6-incher. So we're going to talk about falls and slump piles, debris fields, and pockets in blue clay as areas to collect. So let's start off with slumps or falls. Falls refer to the fact that almost always a tree comes down. And if you look at these piles of debris on the beach where the cliff is falling, what you'll see here, there's a tree associated with it. There's more down there. And you can see, here you see trees where the roots are being exposed. Those are going to come down. When they come down, they don't kind of lean out and fall. They come straight down. When the root mass hits the beach, they fall out into the water, roughly perpendicular to the cliff face. And they bring down a lot of fossil bed with it. Now, the fossil bed obviously is where the teeth are, but you could have to move tens of thousands of tons to find a big tooth. Why do that when water will do it for you? That's my motto. So what we see here, here's a fall. It's been down. This one's been down about 6 months. And you can start to see the lower end of it's being eroded. We're exposing some stuff down here. Here's the tree that brought down. We still have some fall up here. So one of the things you can do, you can look around the base here, or you can go around and look up in here. The problem with this dry material like this is that it's really hard to see teeth in it because dust clings to the surface of the tooth really well. What you need is a good rainstorm. So I'll show you an example here. This is a personally embarrassing example. This is a fall that had been there for about 6 weeks. We'd had no rain. This was in 2017, okay? We'd collected this stretch of beach a number of times, including my field assistants, who are trained specifically to look for megs, giant threshers, and paragoats. We walked by this tooth multiple times. It didn't look like this. Now, if you look really carefully at this tooth, You notice there's a gray area right here and another little gray area here. The rest of it's more rust colored. Teeth, when they get exposed, fossil teeth, when they get exposed to the sun, bleach out to a certain degree. Those gray areas is where it was bleached by the sun. The rust-colored areas was covered by sediment. So we walked by that multiple times. We saw these little parts showing, and we didn't say, oh, that's a buried meg tooth. We get a nice big rainstorm. We get this nice little gully that cuts down through there and exposes this tooth. You can spot it from 30 feet away, no problem. Had we taken more time and said, we should look at this fall a little more carefully, we probably would have spotted it. But first rule of falls, when you're collecting them, after a storm, check every gully. There may be just the tip of a tooth or a corner or something exposed, but that's in a fall, that's where you're most likely to catch a big tooth, is in a gully after a rainstorm. That's where they're going to be exposed. Amazingly, very few people look there. They'll dig in the dirt. Well, they may have a 15-foot long gully, this wide and this deep. They could look up that and see if anything's sticking out. In a fraction of the time, find a big tooth. So in a spall or slump pile, look for teeth in gullies. Now, no slump pile lasts forever. Eventually, rain and wave action is going to pull all of that sediment out. The sand and silt's going to be removed. What's left are usually the tree that came down and produced the fall and what's called a debris field. So the debris field is chunks of big material, as in big megalodon-sized material. This is one of the classic places to look for meg teeth. It's also a place most people hate to collect. You can twist your ankle, it's visually complex. And I've had with my students in my paleo class, I frequently have to say, no, slow down, look here. There's going to be some cool stuff here. And they go, yeah. And they'll take a glance through and they'll walk on. Because it's really hard to collect. But this is where the big stuff is going to be sorted out by winnowing. The other thing to notice here, you'll notice up here, here's some sand. This has all been eroded away by a storm. 3 days before this photo was taken, this was completely covered by sand. So debris fields come and go depending on wave direction and wave strength, producing waves. And that tree that falls down is going to interact with waves, and it produces turbulence, which is going to give you a debris field on one side or the other side of a fallen tree, or maybe on both sides, depending on the conditions. So debris fields are where, first place, if you're going to go out and really have a good chance of looking, debris fields are a good place to start. Now, probably my most famous photo, as many of you know, my wife takes most of the photos for my collecting. There's a reason that I'm a terrible photographer. The problem is taking a photo slows me down and keeps me away from collecting. But there's an old cliche that even a stop clock is right twice a day. Thanks to the wonders of digital photography, if I take enough photos, I'll get one that comes out right. Bar she blows. Now, we talked about search image. This is everybody's search image of a meg. They think when I find a big meg, it's going to look like that. Maybe. Remember we talked about that waves are going to cause a tooth to sink into a beach very quickly? Typically 2 to 3 to 4 waves is all it takes. What you can't really see here is under this little layer of sand, there's actually a big block of blue clay under there. It's actually sitting on about a 1/4 inch of sand, and then the rest of it is blue clay. It has nowhere to sink to. Okay? And you can find teeth like this. But that tooth is just as big as the one on the previous slide. Now, the previous slide, I was the first person down the beach. I used a little misdirection to do it, but I was the first person down the beach. This trip, my field assistants were there, and they know better. They know how to look for big meg teeth. They went roaring down the beach, looking for debris fields. They ran through this one. I was coming up behind, and one of those classic double takes. I'm walking along, and I go like this and start reaching down. Then my brain consciously said, there's a Meg there. And once you get a good search image, and I'm going to teach you how to do that, once you get a good search image, your body will start reacting before you're consciously aware that you're going to pick up something. The downside of that, as my wife will tell you, I'm always stopping in parking lots because I reach down thinking it's a tooth, and it's some little piece of tar or something like that. Okay, so there's a downside to it. But a search image will help you do it. So you look at it, it's how did you ever tell? Well, it doesn't really show. This is really slick and smooth. This is very slightly porous. Because roots are porous, and that's part of my search image. I subconsciously picked that up and started to bend down to pick it up before I was consciously aware I was actually doing it. And then I talked to really good collectors, and I'm talking people who collect 20 to 40 big megs a year. They all talk about that phenomenon. And they'll walk along and say, I just started reaching down and grabbed into this wave and pulled out a tooth. They're so accustomed to seeing a meg tooth from all different perspectives that they can do that. So that's just as big as on the previous slide. You're more likely to find a big meg looking like this, which means you have to collect slowly and carefully. Now, this is a nice stretch of beach. And there's some teeth that came out of it. My class, I had 3 of my students collect this stretch of beach. And I told them, this looks like a really good stretch of beach. There's a lot of teeth here. And so they collected it for like 2 hours. As I said, my field assistants aren't like that. There's one of my field assistants right there. He didn't stop to collect that. In fact, if you look, there's some really wide space footprints. He all but jogged through here to get down here. The reason is, remember, falls and debris fields are associated with fallen trees. He looked down and said, there's a fallen tree, there's going to be a debris field there. This is that same tree from the other side. Look at the difference between that beach and that beach. We're talking about a difference of about 60 feet. The chance of finding a big tooth there is virtually non-existent. Again, not a great monstrous tooth, still the biggest tooth of the trip, but we weren't really under the best conditions. But for the conditions, this is really nice. And we're talking about a tooth this big. Most people are not going to turn their nose up at a meg that big. Yeah, it's not 6 inches, but I'm not going to throw it away. Okay? So, looking for debris fields, look for fallen trees. Because that's where the debris fields are going to develop. And one of the things you find is it's true on the cliffs, but it's also true on places like Stratford or on the opposite side of Chesapeake above Pope's Creek. There's a longshore current. So winnowing also will take a meg tooth that may have fallen just outside of a debris field. In a storm, that longshore current will actually move it into a debris field, and it'll stop there. So debris fields can actually collect teeth as well. So these are the hotbeds for doing it. So you're out collecting with friends, make them stop at the first part, say, there's a lot of teeth here, this is going to be great, and then kind of surreptitiously go to the other side of that tree. Because the first rule of hunting for big megs, or any other, never tell anybody you're looking for big megs. You'll never get rid of them. They're convinced you know the secret, and they're going to be on you like paste. So yeah, I want to find a really nice cow shark tooth. That's what I'm looking for. And say, yeah, this is a good place to hunt for cow shark. I'm going to let you guys look for it. I'll go on down because I'll find out if you guys don't have as much experience. This would be a good place to do it. And then you go here. Okay. Sometimes in debris fields, you're going to find parts of whale skeletons. Now, maybe it's going to be a vertebra like this, which is very nice. But even if it's little fragments, little shards of bone, smaller than your pinky, collect those debris fields very carefully. We know Meg attacked whales. We know Meg scavenged whales. And so there's a high probability that if you're finding a whale skeleton, there's going to be Meg teeth there. Because when that skeleton comes off the top of the cliff and hits the beach, it's going to shatter into tens of thousands of pieces. They're finding any bone at all, collect that debris field especially carefully. Because the probability, I asked one of my field assistants about it who actually had some data, and he said he couldn't find the actual, but he says the probability is something like 3 or 4 times higher than the debris field with no bone. And when you're playing with something rare, 3 or 4 times higher is better than none. So anytime, even little fragments of bone, search that debris field extremely carefully. Okay, pockets in blue clay. Collecting along in this area wouldn't be nearly as dangerous if it wasn't for blue clay. If you've never slipped on blue clay, you're one of the lucky ones. It's wickedly slippery when it's wet. I've had more students go to an emergency room because of blue clay than anything else. It's also a really good place to find meg teeth. So one of the things I want to show you on this particular slide, notice we've got more wave action here than we've had in any of the previous slides. This is what a lot of collectors refer to as a green water beach. It's this kind of translucent, greenish, olive gray water. And if you tell a hardcore meg collector, oh, there's a green water beach at such and such, yeah, they're going to disappear, and you know where they're going to be. Because it's a really good time to find big megs, find whale vertebrae, big chunks of whale rib. Any big fossil tends to show up on a green water beach. What happens, they get picked, teeth and other things get picked up, they skip across this blue clay. These, if you don't know, these are old fossil shrimp burrows here. This is from a log, more of that. And they get dumped into these little depressions here and then get covered up with other stuff. And people slip and slide on the blue clay and get off of it as soon as they can, which is, if you're not prepared, is probably a good idea, okay? This is the one time I have specialized collecting equipment. And here I am, I can't look at this photo without feeling some residual pain. This is at the end of a very long trip. My shoulders were killing me. I could barely walk. We also did really well. We actually found a bunch of fossils, bunch of parts of a sea cow in one of the falls we were collecting. But I was so stiff and sore, the quarter mile of the car seemed like forever. But if you're going to collect blue clay a lot, or where you collect there's a lot of blue clay, I would suggest certain things. These are called gem or treasure scoops. They used to be called gem scoops, so they have a blue handle. That's the old S-wing, which was the gem scoop. The red handle, it's called a treasure scoop. It's the same thing. And actually, a treasure scoop comes in 2 sizes, which is nice. The taller size is better for taller people. Or a clam or cultivator rake. If you buy a clam rake, it's going to be less than if you buy a cultivator rake, and they're exactly the same thing. Okay. The one I've shown here is a fiberglass handle, which is lighter than a hickory handle. It's more expensive, but after you've been walking for 3 hours, pulling that thing around, weight becomes an issue, so I'd go with the fiberglass. You also need something for grip on blue clay. What I use, and there's a number of ones out there similar to this, I usually call the Yak Tracks, and it's basically a silicone mesh which has stainless steel springs on it. And when you can walk across blue clay and not slip at all, it's fabulous. So here I am, I've got my treasure scoop, and back here I have a fishing vest, and in the back here there's a D-ring, and there's a carabiner holding my Yak Tracks. I get to blue clay, I can pull them off. 2 minutes later, I'm off on the blue clay. When I'm done, I take them off and hang them back up, and off I go. And I don't have to worry about falling, which is, as I said, a big issue if you have a lot of blue clay around. Now, here's a lot of blue clay, and there are some depressions in it. And I've actually cleaned 2 of them out with my treasure scoop. And you'll notice that there are some differences. They're labeled A, B, and C. C up at the top has really fine debris in it. In fact, there's only like a ½ inch, 3/4 of an inch in it, so I didn't even need to scrape it out to see what was there. B has bigger material. We're lower on the beach. Remember, winnowing's involved. A is still lower on the beach, and it has the biggest material, it has the biggest rocks. So when you're looking in depressions in blue clay, the biggest teeth or the biggest chunks of bone or whatever are going to be in the depressions lowest on the beach. Again, it's all due to winnowing. So here's this is a tooth that was from, this is actually a strange pocket in blue clay. The pocket actually extends from low tide all the way up to the cliff, and there's blue clay for like 50 feet on both sides of it. This is the bottom of that really big pocket, and there's a 5.5 inch tooth. Now, if they're in there for a long time, you notice it kind of batters around the enamel here. This is the most delicate part of the tooth. And if they get washed around, this is in big waves. This is kind of like a big rock tumbler, and it can bang them up pretty quickly. Quickly, we're talking a matter of weeks to months. If they're freshly in this pool, they're still going to be in really pretty pristine condition. But again, you're seeing they're being sorted by size. The rocks here are similar in size to that tooth, again, due to winnowing. Okay, so that's the right places. Let's talk about right conditions. There are two that we'll talk about. Strong wave action from storms, and we'll talk about the day after a storm. So this is, I was a collecting trip I was on about 1.5 years ago. And it's actually a day I chose not to continue collecting. Remember we talked about a green water beach. This looks similar, but it's really not. This looks more like cappuccino, melted chocolate ice cream. You can't see more than about that far into the water. The chances of you falling over this tree or a block of clay is really high. I did this once in my life. I've collected in these conditions. And I was talking to somebody about that earlier. Incredibly terrifying, but in 45 minutes, I collected 11 teeth between 3 and 5 inches. And I'll never do it again. I know 2 people who will go on this type of beach where getting around over this stuff and those falls like that, hey, there's a little nice stretch of beach right there. They go in chest waders with 2 belts around it to keep water from rushing in if they fall, and they wear an orange life jacket like you would if you were on a boat. I personally, if I have to dress up like that, I'll go have a beer, okay? But there are a lot of stuff, but it's a very dangerous time to collect. So I'd say there are conditions where I won't collect. There's no tooth worth going out there and drowning. So if you're going in conditions like this, be prepared and don't go alone. Like I said, I did that once. I will never do it again. Okay, so here's a beach I would collect in a storm. Again, it's a green water beach, more open. The falls are not as big. You notice these trees, and the cliff here is actually only about 20 feet, 30 feet high. The falls here are pretty small, and so you see there's some debris fields. You can see again where the storm here, the wind's out of the southeast, and in this particular beach, a southeast breeze always pulls sand off. You can see eroding the beach and exposing all of this stuff. Back down here, there's some bigger debris fields, and that's actually where I'm heading. And this is a nice beach. You don't have big trees to climb over. You don't have to wade out around them where you have a chance of tripping. The waves here, you're talking about 14, 16-inch waves. You have to be prepared for it. 6 inches of moving water will knock you off your feet if you're not careful. 14 to 16 inches, yeah, it can knock you off and roll you around on the beach a bit. So you have to be prepared, but it can be worth it. So here's this green water beach. Here's chunks of clay, and you sit around, and that's what pops out. That's a 6-inch meg, actually a little over 6 inches. Those teeth, when you've got a good wave action on a good green water beach, those teeth are being tossed around on the beach all the time. I was lucky. This one got wedged between those 2 pieces of clay. If it hadn't, it would have been washed up by one wave, and the next one would have pulled it right back out. And my experience, once you lose them over the subtidal break, that you may have to wait there for hours for it to pop up there again. And I'm too lazy to do that. So when you find a beach that's safe to collect during a storm, the results can be spectacular. But again, you have to be prepared because moving water has a lot of power. Now, you don't actually have to have a storm where you are. For instance, this time of year and going into the fall, we get a lot of tropical storms or hurricanes moving offshore. So even though we may not be getting rain and that here, what you are getting is the wind and the wave action because of it. And so you have these coastal flood advisories or warnings or watches. Here's a green water beach. And these are some of my students. There is a debris field right here, a really nice debris field, actually. It was tough to collect because the storm surge was coming in. And the point of putting this up is there's a couple. One, again, it doesn't have to be raining where you're going to collect if there's a storm offshore. That can be enough. So watch for storm, coastal watches, advisories, and warnings. Any of those, be prepared because it can get dicey. So you want to be very prepared. You also notice this. Now, fortunately, this is very rare because the tree actually got blown over, and as the tree is down over the top of the cliff. So the tree's already blown down, it just fell the opposite direction it normally does. So it's just the root mass here. So my student here in the red cap is staying there to tell students, walk along this fallen tree, get out to that first branch, take a left, and you can hike back over and get over here where it's safe. Because even though it's not going to come down as a whole tree, it's rotting, and at some point it's going to rot through and that root mass is going to come down. Now, the reason you don't want to be there when when a fall comes down, that's an average fall. That's me for scale. Remember I showed you that slide a few back where I said I was just exhausted, my shoulders were sore and everything? That was the end of that trip. This is the beginning of that trip. We had 9 falls we had to get around on that trip, and they were all relatively fresh. We also collected 5 big megs, 4 inches or better, on that trip. So collecting during a storm can be incredibly productive. It can be dangerous, it can be exhausting, it can be daunting, but they're out there. Now, I did a lot of that when I was younger. Now that I'm over 50, I'm not quite that adventurous. So you're going to hear this here, and then I'll deny I ever said it. Okay? If I was going to pick a time to get a big meg, if you're in the right place, the best time to go is the morning after a big storm has passed through. First of all, you got these beautiful bluebird skies, bright blue skies. The beach has been torn up for 1 or more days, so a lot of big stuff is going to be exposed. You know, and you do have some stuff. We just have this little collapse here. This was also, we had actually been collecting for 4 days in a row on this stretch of beach. This much, so we know how much sand was removed, and you can see all this big stuff down here. You can also get what's called a Seiche-induced low tide. Seiche is sloshing of water in a basin. So you imagine you have a basin of water and you start going like this, it's going to slosh back and forth. That same phenomenon occurs in lakes and embayments. So we have a storm, the wind's coming out of the east, it's forcing all of these waves up against, say, Calvert Cliffs for 1 or more days. The water level on the western side of the bay is actually going to be higher than it is on the east side. And so if this is the level of water in the bay on a calm day, and this is the cliffs, we get a storm blowing it, the water level is going to be like this. Once that wind drops, gravity is going to force that water equal, and it's going to slosh in Chesapeake Bay like this, east to west. If that down slosh coincides with a low tide, you're going to get a lower than expected low tide. It's going to expose everything out to and including the shell flats, which are almost never exposed. You're going to have stretches 200, 300, 400 yards long of nothing but big debris to look through. I did a quick check through my collecting notes the time I gave this before to my class. 3/4 of all of my teeth, 5 inches or better, from Calvert Cliffs were collected on those days. Now, I may only collect 2 or 3 of those days a year, and that's when I've collected most of my big teeth. Now, they may be at odd angles. You find weird things like, because you may find a tooth angled down into the mud like that and sticking up this far. But my biggest teeth and easiest to collect are on those days, because you can collect for hours in basically a debris field. And that's the absolute best time, although it's rare, a couple times a year. If you can get a low tide the morning after a storm has passed through, that's going to be your best time to collect. Your highest chance, because you get these size-enhanced low tides. Okay, so focus collecting. How am I doing on time? Oh, doing great, good. Everything there is stuff we've talked about, okay? I want to tell you the story about the tooth that's on the cover of Fossil Sharks of Chesapeake Bay. Because there's a second meaning to focused collecting. This obviously happened a number of years ago now. I was down at a place unnamed on Calvert Cliffs. That's the second rule of collecting giant megs. If you find one, don't tell anybody exactly where you found it. You want to be able to find a parking space next time you go down to collect. Okay? I was down collecting, and it was at the tail end of a storm. We quite hadn't lost all the wind yet. It was still breezy, but not as windy as it had been. We didn't have the bluebirds because it was still cloudy. I got down on the beach, and there were a couple of local teenagers who I knew were very good collectors. I'd talked to them before, and they were walking down the beach. And so I thought, well, I'll hang back 80 or 100 feet, and there's a chance something will wash in between us. And so I'm walking down the beach, and the beach when we started off was about 30 feet wide. We got to one point, it narrowed down to about 8 feet. And they were in the wash area collecting. And there was a sandbar here, and there were some tundra swans that were sitting behind that sandbar, hanging out. I guess they rode out the storm there or something. They were hanging out there. And so these guys are walking along and watching these tundra swans. And so I'm walking along, and I got this narrow thing, and I'm walking along, and I look at, and there's a Hostalis tooth about this big sitting there up against the cliff. I thought, cool. They were so busy looking at the tundra swans, they didn't see it. So I thought, cool, I'm not going to tell them. So I bent over, and I picked it up, and I looked like 3 feet down the beach, and here's a whale vertebrae about the size of my fist. So I got down on my right knee, and I reached out and I grabbed it. So here I am, I'm on one knee, on a wet beach with waves going around, and I looked down about another 4 or 5 feet, there's that tooth. When I got up there, I actually measured. There was a footprint of one of theirs 2.5 feet from that tooth. Down here. So they literally walked in 2.5 feet of that tooth and didn't see, two experienced players didn't see because they were too busy watching the tundra swan. So never take a step until you make sure you haven't overlooked something. I also didn't tell them I found that tooth either. I kept collecting. I got a lot of other nice teeth too, although my collecting really fell off after we got past the tundra swans. Okay? So focus collecting, focus on what you're doing. I put my website here. I've actually put up this slide deck on the resources page of my website. This slide deck is up there if you want to look at it. You're welcome to. There's a slide show of us with my students collecting, showing some other stuff that we do. I have one more slide. It's not in the slide deck. I'm going to give you some homework. Hey, I taught for 30 years. It's in my blood. Okay? We're going to talk about how to get a better search image for big meg teeth. Now, if you have a big meg tooth, you can use this is fine. If you don't, which a lot of people don't for some reason, There's some really nice replicas on eBay. This is not a real tooth. That's a replica, 5.5-inch replica. What you're looking for, you want kind of some medium to dark shades. So the really reasons I brought Maggie here is, a replica this color is good to play with, or this one's kind of a brownish gray, dark brownish gray is good. And what you want to do, you want it high quality, so you want to see the porous nature of the root, you want to see cracks are there, you want to see serrations are there, the burlette should be there. And then what you're going to do is going to leave it around your house in odd places. Or have your roommate or significant other move it around, stick it down in the sofa cushions, hide it behind a vase on a shelf, so that you can only see bits and pieces of it in different bits and pieces at a time. What's going to happen over time is your search image is going to become really good. And you'll walk in, you may see a tiny, the tip of that tooth behind a vase of flowers and realize the Meg's right there. I can't claim credit for this. 3 of my students in my paleo class started doing this. They actually went to the point they actually would go to the beach, and one of them would be searching, the other 2 would hide it somewhere, and the reason they used 2 to hide is they didn't want to lose it. So both of them would keep an eye on where it was, and so it'd be in front of one of them, but the other one could see it. The third person didn't know where it was. It was somewhere between these 2, and they'd have to come find it and see how quickly they could do it. And it's surprising how quickly you can start finding Megs just by seeing a tiny fraction of the whole tooth. And so that's your homework. Practice looking for big Megs. You don't have to go to the beach, which is sad. But if it's a nasty day, you can do it at home, and you'll very quickly become much more adept at finding Megs. And you'll start finding yourself going and realize what you've seen is a tiny fraction of a Meg, and you aren't consciously aware of it when you actually start moving toward it. So I will stop there, and I'll take any questions you have.
A couple of questions in the chat on Zoom.
Sure.
About IDing specimens, are there subspecies that make ID tougher? Does the life age of the specimen affect ID difficulty?
Does the specimen...
I guess the question is about how do you identify the species of Meg that you have found?
That gets tricky. And the problem is, if we look at the evolution of Meg from ancestral Ototus, we aren't dealing with real species. Okay? Biological species, and we're all biologically Homo sapiens, are individuals that can freely interbreed with each other. We know nothing about Meg breeding. Okay? And so what we see is this gradual transition. We're looking at a very small part of the body, and a part that has nothing to do with reproduction. And so what we're looking at is what are called morphospecies. So we see this gradual transition from one to the other. And so when you're identifying these morphospecies, you typically look at the structure of the tooth and what horizon they came out of, what fossil bed they came out of. But even that gets complicated. So for instance, along Calvert Cliffs, you start to northern end, you get a mixture of Cubutensis and Megalodon. As you go south, you start losing chubs and getting Megalodon. But there's beds where you get a mixture, still get a mixture of both over a period of 2.5 million years. So yeah, it's a combination of things to identify these morphospecies, combination of tooth shape and where they were found.
For out-of-state folks, when is the best time of year to visit Maryland to look for Megs?
You didn't hear this from me. October, November, March, and April. Our biggest, best storms are those 4 months. A day like today, close to 100 degrees, no breeze, yeah, I wouldn't go looking for Megs unless I went to a museum and learned a photograph. But yeah, October, November, and March and April. There, you can certainly find
storms.
Huh?
That's the best storms you said?
Those are the best storms, yeah. Those that tend to be the ones that move the most stuff on the beach, yeah. Yeah, those tend to be, and one of the things you do, if you have a favorite beach, one of the things you want to figure out, and it's pretty easy to do if you can get there fairly often, what direction does the wind come from that produces the most disruption to the beach? For instance, along Calvert Cliffs, the longshore current is north to south. Any wind out of the north-southeast, so we got the longshore current, like we have a wind out of the southeast, they're fighting each other and pushing it against the cliffs, and you get this incredible turbulence against the cliffs. So along Calvert Cliffs, any strong wind out of the southeast, can you say tropical storm? You're going to get huge disruption to the beach. Day after that, I would go out and say, I'm going to find me a big Meg today. So yeah, those 4 months we get the best wind in this area. The other side of that is anytime you can get away. Yeah. Because I found Megs in every month except August. Big Megs in every month except August. Typically the ones I find in the summer, they're a tiny little part exposed. Typically, like this part of the lingual protuberance is exposed and the rest of it is buried. That's typically what I see if I'm collecting in like May through September, something like that. That's what I would see. Bizarrely enough, 2 of my biggest Megs in the winter along the bay, I got by flipping over chunks of ice on the beach, and they were stuck to the bottom of the ice. That is way too much work. Anything that has go over you keeps you warm. But yeah, it's a lot of work to do that. But we found big teeth. In fact, we found one of the nice Paratotus I know of from the bay was collected that way. Yeah.
Do you pick up smaller teeth when you see them as well, or do you just focus on the bigger teeth to stay focused?
I typically, right now, I'm not looking for big Megs at all. If I find one, sure, I'll let one of my students pick it up. Again, some of you know the story. 30 years ago now, 25 years ago, my wife and I decided we would cap my collection to keep from overtaking our lives. We capped my collection at 26,000 teeth. So if I want to keep a tooth, I have to get rid of one. Yeah, if I have a 6-inch bag, yeah, I'll get rid of this little Carcharodontis, no problem. But yeah, I don't collect big Megs anymore, unless they're really in prime condition. I'll let one of my students pick it up because they will never have collected one before. Now, if I find, what I'm looking for primarily right now are giant threshers, Paratotus, and fetal and neonatal Megs, which are much smaller. I've got a really good search image for fetal Megs now. I can find fetal Megs and neonatal Megs, which are like 3/8 of an inch to 3/4 of an inch. I can find those really well now. I'm really good at that. Have you ever heard anyone talking about Hubble teeth? Hubble teeth are these fetal and neonatal Meg teeth. And that's what most of my Meg research now is on those.
How many Paratotus teeth do you have from Calvert?
I personally don't have any from Calvert. Oh wait, I have one. I know of probably 15. The thing about the Paratotus during the Miocene, they're not nearly as big as the big massive ones you see from Lee Creek. And so a lot of people have them and just think they're some kind of funny makeup. And so people have me look at their collection. I have these Mako teeth. They go, oh yeah, here's a nice Paratotus. Oh no, that's just a Mako. No, that's a Paratotus. Miocene Paratotus are pretty lightly built compared to the Pliocene ones. And so a lot of people misidentify them. So I'm sure there are a lot more out there. Same thing with the giant threshers. Most people think that they're either a Hostalis, farther back in jaw, Hostalis, or some type of white shark. So again, I think there's more out there than people know of. I've done more work looking at actual position of giant threshers and Cliff. I know of 28. I know the exact locality along Calvert Cliff for the giant thresher. Yeah.
When you say fetal, exactly, are you talking about one that
hasn't been born yet?
Okay.
Yeah. So fetal hasn't been born yet. Neonatal is the first year after they're born. Okay. And so I'm typically working on teeth, typically 2 inches or smaller. And most of them I'm working with are like a 1/2 inch to 1 inch.
What usually runs, do they usually want to who are there inside?
We assume numerous. So if you're getting fetal teeth, this means the mother died. and the carcass is scavenged, and so these fetuses are being lost, right, and then they're being scavenged.
Right, not like, tiger sharks and
Oh yeah, I'm sure the lamniforms do that. So I suspect there's egg predation and things like that in Megalodon, but that's not where the teeth are coming from.
Okay, so how many pups would you assume?
I would assume there's,
Like great white?
I'd be similar to great whites or big makos, something like that, comparable. We really don't know. We have really no way of knowing until at some point we find a pregnant female that's fully preserved with all the individuals inside, which is like, yeah, the chances of that. I know of one Meg skeleton, which as far as I know, still hasn't been excavated from Peru. And, it's all 6-inch teeth and crushed skull and vertebral column. And it's still not been excavated fully. But, finding one with all the pups and that. Now, if we found something like little piles of fetal teeth in that skeleton, I'd say, oh yeah, well, we have 6 piles of little fetal teeth, right?
Yeah, right.
But
What are they waiting for? Would be fossil?
purely politics.
I mean,
It's purely politics. In fact, I was originally asked to not assist with the excavation, but to consult. It's in Peru. They're so afraid it's going to somehow be smuggled out of the country to the United States or some country in Europe that they basically won't let anybody touch it. In fact, it's long ago now. It's probably gone. It's in a place where sandblasting from coastal winds is really high. So I know of one big Hostalis skeleton now, which is now completely gone just by being blasted by sand from wind.
Doesn't it make you look physically sick? Like, that it's
Yeah.
there and
Yeah, seeing a pile of 6-inch tooth, the size of this, twice the size of this table, and there's probably 40 teeth there up to 6 inches high, and the skulls around it. It's crushed, but the skull's there. And then you see the British palm going like this, It's various estimates of length. I think most of it estimates putting it about 45 to 48 feet. So it's a big one, probably a female. When they're that big, it's probably almost certainly going to be a female.
How do you tell a fetal from men?
You really can't. The one thing about fetal teeth is there's virtually no wear on them. Neonate teeth have a fair amount of wear on them. Particularly the tip tends to get worn very quickly, but most of the smallest ones that I collected, and the smallest one I have is 15 millimeters slant height. We're talking 3/8 of an inch or thereabouts. A little more than that, 5/8 of an inch slant height. And you get those little, there's no wear on them at all. So if they're feeding in the uterus, what they're feeding on individuals which don't have any hardened calcium, no calcified cartilage or anything, it's just soft tissue, so there's nothing to wear the teeth. So the really small ones you see no wear, so we're sure those are fetal, but there's no real obvious change in tooth form between fetal and neonatal. And then there's really just a minor one between neonatal and juvenile, which start getting more of an adult tooth form. It's possible. It's not really common in lamniforms. Lamniforms, you tend to have this interuterine cannibalism, which is kind of the norm across the lamniforms, but across the whole range of them. So it's possible, but it's unlikely. It'd be rare. In fact, I can't think of a lamniform that does that. And I think they all have interuterine cannibalism.
A couple more questions on Zoom, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I'll give you 2 of them. Given the number of extinct animals and the number of collectors over time, when might we expect to stop being able to find Megs on the beach? And then the second question asks if you can recommend someone who gives guided tours to good beaches.
As to the first one, I don't think we'll ever run out of Megs.
Will allowing us to use.
Well, you may run out of people allowing you onto their property, and one of the reasons I don't typically give out names of places I collect. Well, there's an old story. I live, down by, as they say, 8 miles as the crow flies from the White House, or 2 hours by car. We have a standing joke down there. You have a new neighbor that comes in, you find out they work for the CIA, and then you say, what do they do? And so I can tell you, but I have to kill you. It's like, I'm not going to tell you where this tooth is because the person whose property has this tooth would be inundated. Okay? I've had sites disappear when I told people where I collected something. So guided tours on the bay are tough. I suggest join a fossil club. That's the best way to do it. You're going to have people there know what they're doing, know where to collect. They want to help you. That's the best way to learn is join a fossil club. In terms of running out of meg teeth, I don't think so because of our activities. We're actually getting more erosion than we had in the past. And so I think we're actually producing more erosion in many areas onto the beach than we had 100 years ago. And the erosion weights are, in one of my other lives, I had a side hustle analyzing oysters in archaeological sites. And as part of that, I ended up reading the 1880 census, which is a review of the oyster industry in the United States. And part of that, there was a map of Calvert Cliff. So we know actually how much it's eroded between now and 1880. Much of the erosion has been in the last 30 or 40 years, despite efforts to stop it. It's actually eroding now faster now than it was back then. And that's in part because where we have beaches to collect now used to be oyster beds, which break up wave action, which keeps the cliffs more stable. Yeah, back in the day, as they say, there were so many oysters in Chesapeake Bay, there were no beaches, and the entire Chesapeake Bay could be filtered by the oysters in 3 days. Now it's figured it's about a year and a half. They could theoretically filter all the water in the bay from the oysters that are in there. So yeah, I think we're not going to run out of megs. Well, let's just say we're not going to run out of megs. As soon as we run out of megs, we'll know it because they'll stop selling them on eBay, right? And if you look how many megs there are on eBay, there's got to be a lot of them out there. Other questions?
So beachcombing at the public parks like Calvert Cliffs and Dry Ponds and some of those is going to be a worthwhile day trip?
Yeah, it will. And again, you have to time it with conditions. And once you're there, find might find a fall and you might look at it all, but really day in, day out, the bread and butter place to collect teeth is debris fields. And once you start recognizing there's a tree, there's a tree, there's a tree, and you can tell an experienced collector who's looking for megs. You see someone jogging on the beach and they don't look buff. They're going from one debris field to another. Okay? Actually, I know people, in fact, those two high school students that I was talking about, I've seen them jog on the beach and collect more teeth than I was back in the day when I wasn't quite as experienced, that I was going more slowly. But yeah, if you see someone who's obviously a collector jogging across the sand beach, yeah, maybe. You wait, there's a way to find out. You have to say, oh, you're looking for teeth? This is a really good stretch right here. If they stop, then yeah, they're just starting. If they keep running, yeah, they're going to the next tree. If they stop at the next tree, you know what they're up to. So yeah, never tell anybody you're looking for big megs. Which is why I told you I'm not looking for big megs, right? I'm looking for other things. Which just happen to occur in debris fields too. What can I say? Other questions?
I'd like to know a little bit more about your pace. If you got cover of a debris field and say it's the size of this table, and you've got good matrix, what time are you spending there?
On one the size of that table,
Yeah.
I could collect that in probably 5 minutes. Now, most people would look at that and be gone in 30 seconds or less. In general, most collectors hate collecting debris fields. You can tell them this is where the big stuff is, and they'll go, don't see anything, and go off to the nice sandy part of the beach where it's easier to collect. So yeah, that, remember I showed you that debris field, the two sides of that tree where they had the gravelly beach and the debris field? My student that collected that stretch there, he spent an hour collecting that stretch. And, so for one the size of this room, yeah, it would take an hour to collect it by yourself. Because what you're going to see is you have to look really under every little piece of clay that's there. Because you could look out there and just see cutting edge underneath that clay. Well, if you're taking a quick look and say, yeah, this would be a good place, and you wander through it like this, and 10 minutes later you're gone. Yeah, you're going to miss 99% of what's there that's worth collecting. Yeah, there will be some stuff laying out there, but everybody's going to see that wandering through. But the stuff, because meg teeth are so heavy for their size, they're almost always going to be at least partially buried. And so you're looking for just that little corner that's showing. Debris fields, particularly I find at Stratford, there's some really nice debris fields at Stratford, and I find a lot of them that I find there, they're partially buried and just this part of the tooth is showing. You might see a little part of the burlette here showing, but it's this part of the tooth that's showing. Something like here, like maybe the size of a poker chip on this tooth, and that's all that's showing. On the Calvert Cliffs, I find because we get a lot more wave action because you got more fetch, a bigger distance from the eastern shore to the cliffs. You can get bigger waves, and so it can throw teeth into odd positions when they're buried. And so along the cliffs, you're going to find a lot more like you see this or this. My biggest tooth ever, I saw 1/4 inch of the tip exposed, and that was it. It was sitting like this with 1/4 inch of the tip exposed. On a beach, there were probably 20 people collecting that day. And I almost stepped on it. I went like, wow. And so I started digging. And one of the guys, I said, what'd you find? I said, I found a meg. And we were, at that point, we were kind of alone on the beach. And he said, well, how big is it? I don't know. And all of a sudden, someone else comes running up and says, how big is it? And I said, we don't know. We're digging. By the time we got it out, there were like 7 people there. And I was talking to the guy I was with. He says, how do they know I was digging up a meg tooth? He says, nobody digs on a beach unless it's a meg. And he's right. I started digging. All of a sudden, people seemed to come out of the cliff to find out what I was doing. But yeah, and you can still see on that tooth today, and it's absolutely flawless. If you look on the labial face, you can see it just very faintly. The tip is slightly lighter colored than the rest of it. It leaked out. So it's been in that position for quite a while. So 1/4 inch, so this much of the tooth was exposed. And that's all I saw. And it's like this. Biggest mega, not technically the biggest. I have several that are slightly bigger, but the biggest absolutely flawless meg I've ever collected. And it is flawless. Every serration is in. And it was like I almost stepped. I thought, oh my God, if I'd have stepped in, I'd snap the tip off.
Some of the med teeth that you see, some of them, like, they're really wide. Very, very wide. And then some of them are, I understand that they're for position, but the width of the tooth, is that mean anything?
That's position in the jaw. As you go back in the jaw, the teeth get lower and wider. So you can actually, to a fair degree, determine position. So this tooth is actually easy. This is the 3rd lower anterior on the right side. So it's sitting right here. And it's because of the curvature like this. This curvature right here tells us the back of that bulla. There's 2 bullets where teeth form in laminiforms. And the first one, the anterior, has 3 teeth. And the one in the back gets pushed against the edge of it and you get this rounded. The thickness tells us it's lower. And so, yeah, this is either a subadult male or, no, this is going to be a fully adult male or a subadult female, because you can't tell gender, but from the size. This is not going to be, if it gets bigger than this, it's going to be female. Yeah, just based on laminiforms, there's that discrepancy between male and female. So this is, yeah, you can do position pretty well. Now, once you get back here, like lateral 1 through lateral 6, they kind of all look alike. It's hard to tell. Once you get beyond that, the shape changes pretty dramatically back towards the corner of the jaw. So the first end, the anterior teeth are pretty easy. The teeth in the middle of the jaw are tough, and then back towards the corner they become easier again.
Has anybody ever sized teeth by weight?
Yeah, the problem with it is that we get permineralization. And so permanently we get minerals precipitating out in the tooth. So this tooth weighs more than average because it's really heavily mineralized. Why Maggie could drop it on her foot and she got a bruise and the tooth came out totally intact. It's really heavily mineralized. And so it weighs more. The teeth themselves are not all that heavy. There are some teeth from Cuba which basically had no permineralization. We just lost the protein matrix. Everything else is there, and they're pretty light. Shark teeth in general are pretty light. So yeah, they differ on how many minerals are precipitated out.
Pathological.
Mhm.
That's happening. That's pathological.
Mhm.
What have you found in the Megalodon or any other species? And that's another question, there's follow-up question to that.
Okay. Yeah, I found a lot of pathological teeth. Pathological teeth are due to damage to the germinative tissues in the jaw.
Right.
I found, I don't know how many, I don't keep track. I found a lot. The strangest one I have is I have a meg from Lee Creek that's this high and this wide, and the crown is twisted 180 degrees.
Wow.
Absolutely flawless. And that just happens because the damage to the germinative tissues got twisted, and so every tooth after that is like that. So if any of you have access to my paper I did with George Powell on the dentition of keratosis, there's one position where we have the functional tooth and 4 backup teeth. And the backup teeth increased in size by 5%. Just the way it came out, we didn't plan that. It just happened to be 5%. And we have these teeth, and the crown, it's a very narrow root, and the crown is hooked like this, hooked towards the outside. And we have 4 of those, a functional tooth and the 4 replacement teeth up in the jaw. Sure.
What's up with all of the Moroccan teeth? There is a ton. On eBay, if you go on there, I mean, you can just find so many. I mean, I understand that that's.
So what's your question?
What's up with, there's something in the water in Morocco that makes all those?
No, there's really good fossil beds in Morocco for a variety of things, particularly shark's teeth. And back in the day, because Morocco was originally a colony of France, people used to vacation in Morocco. They'd take their families and they'd go for 2 weeks and play on the beach, and then they'd go collect fossil teeth for a week or two, and they'd sell them to be able to pay for their vacation. That was a very common lifestyle for French for a long time. The Moroccans, like many developing countries, started to worry about their national heritage being taken away. So as I understand it now, there are people that are licensed to ship teeth out of Morocco. Whole body fossils is a very different, there are also some really nice dinosaur fossils, and those are a very different issue, and they're not leaving the country. But there are apparently people licensed now to go in, and if you look at most of them will say Caribga. That's not where they were found. That's where the market is.
That's where the what?
The market is where they sell them. That's where the middlemen live. So people bring them in, sell them to the middleman in Caribga, and then they get shipped out. So they're not actually being collected in Caribga. And it's one of those things where we think we're tough here on not wanting to tell where our fossil beds are. Yeah, there apparently if you go to somebody else's fossil bed, you could get shot. And there are several places around the world where, yeah, going to somebody's fossil bed could get you shot.
So these are phosphate beds that they're getting these teeth out of Morocco?
They're not really phosphate beds because that really orange coloration is from these really anhydrous sands. They're really dry sands, and so what you're getting in there is a lot of iron deposits, which is why this is heavy. This has a lot of iron in it. And so the ones from that beautiful butterscotch color that you get in Moroccan teeth. It's a high mineral content of iron. And so they're sands. These are basically cliff faces. And as the winds scour them, they are exposed and fall out. So they're we think of sandstone, but it's this really friable sandstone apparently that just falls apart. One of my colleagues, David Ward, used to collect there and work there for years, and he says, yeah, it's, you think it's, it's sandstone, you go up like this, and it just kind of falls apart when you run your finger across it. So it's very soft, it's easy to collect, and you can collect hundreds and hundreds of teeth very quickly.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Has to do with that too. Why are they getting so many large, like a tortoise obliquus there? You rarely find larger tortoise here.
Well, I think it's a matter of scale. They're collecting there over an area of probably several hundred square miles of exposed fossil bed. You're looking for a tortoise here, you've got a bed maybe this deep that runs 100 yards and that's it. Well, a tortoise is a top predator, and so there's relatively few of them. But if you're taking that layer and spreading it over multiple exposures over 100 square miles, there's just more opportunity for them to be found.
Is that the same age as the monster? Yes.
Yeah. In fact, if you look at the position maps, Maryland and Morocco are almost at the same latitude in the Eocene. So we're kind of across this narrower version of the Atlantic, and we go like this, and Morocco goes like this. Actually, we're going like this over time. So yeah, we're actually surprisingly close to Morocco in the late Eocene. Yeah, Lucy.
Is there a sensory trick for the study for just guessing coloration?
Coloration really, there's two things that are involved. They're typically going to be very close in coloration to the sediment. So this came out of sediment that had a lot of iron in it. In fact, where this tooth came, remember I showed you that one where I went with my students and they had those ugly indurated rock that was kind of rust-colored rock. This came out of a bunch of stuff like that, and that's why it's this colored. So light sediment, you're going to get lighter teeth. The darker the sediments, you're going to get darker teeth. The one problem is black teeth. Black teeth, black teeth can arise for two reasons. There's a lot of bone, because as bone dissolves, they release calcium phosphate. If there's ferric ion in the groundwater, it precipitates iron 3 phosphate, which is black. And so you can get black teeth that way if it comes out of a bone bed. Also, reworked teeth tend to be black because they've typically been dropped into areas where it's anaerobic, and then they get washed back up and worked back up and they become black. So the black ones, you can have two possible explanations for the black ones.
Oh.
No problem.
I found where Newberry is, and before you go across the Heritage Bridge, there's a marina. Right there. I just not how and I found amongst all the other standard colors, I found a perfectly white.
Yeah, it's not been mineralized, is all it is. Like I said, those come out fairly common in Cuba. In fact, Cuba's known, and I've actually handled some of those in Cuba. You can get big teeth, and you pick them up, and it's like, wow, is this like styrofoam? And they're just, just kind of this creamy white crown, and just a slightly darker root, but they're very pale.
How much heavier is and then the why if we were to have that tooth right there, leaving back in time
In a big submarine.
Yellow submarine.
Big submarine.
Big yellow submarine.
Well, okay, yellow. And hope they don't eat big bananas. Okay.
A tooth of that size, if it was just plucked right out of, and I understand it's like things or whatever, but how much heavier would a fresh tooth be?
Fresh tooth is probably going to weigh, of this tooth, it's probably going to weigh about 3/4, maybe 80% of what this tooth does.
And then, of course, there's the drawing it out, but.
Right. Yeah, drying has a huge effect on it because it's like a fresh, great white tooth. You press your finger against it, like as a friend of mine says, if you're putting a stamp on an envelope, it'll cut. If you let that tooth dry for an hour in the sun, there's a 1 protein molecule thick layer to the cutting edge, and that curls as the tooth dries, and you can take your finger like that and it won't cut. Yeah, Lucy. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I haven't. No, I know people that are doing it. There's some work in progress on that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's some work going on. There's a lot of stuff being done on mineral composition of teeth and where they fit in food pyramids. And so there's a lot of the stabilized isotopes. We're just starting now. The problem is most people don't like to give up meg teeth. If we cut up your 6-inch meg tooth and grind it to powder, no. Are you volunteering that one? Lucy, if you want to do that study, he's got one to volunteer.
So what do you do? Use like dental tools and get the middle of the.
Yeah, you have to get into the middle because the surface is going to be exchanging with the environment. Yeah, so you basically have to cut into the middle of the tooth, and so it's basically destructive sampling. Now, I have meg teeth that I'd let people look at, but they're so heavily mineralized that, they'd say, yeah, I'm going to ruin my saw cutting that one open. And it's ugly.
How big is the farthest posterior tooth
How far is it? Big? Posterior for this one is going to be about like this, about that high. And those are actually the hardest teeth to find, are the posteriors, because sharks don't lose the back teeth as often as the front teeth. The front teeth are doing most of the work, and they actually get replaced more often as they go back in the jaw. Sorry? I'm guessing 2 meters, 2.5 maybe. By the judge, the size of the teeth. Yeah, I'm guessing 2.5 meters. Yeah, because when you look at the smallest meg teeth, they're the size of a typical Carcharinus tooth that we find as fossils. Yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't want to mess with them even when they were born. Yeah, I wouldn't want to mess with those.
So these teeth are measuring in Cuba. What time frame are they from?
I want to say, I'd have to go back. I think they are. Langian, so they're going to be early middle Miocene, roughly the age of the middle of the Calvert Cliffs. And I haven't seen any bigger than about 5.5 inches. I haven't seen any really big ones. The biggest ones I've seen altogether are coming from Chile. And the biggest one I've seen, one, it's spectacular because it just barely fit in a cigar box. And two, it was entirely opalized. And a lot of the ones coming out of Chile now are opalized. Yeah. I'm selectively retired. I can't afford teeth like that. Either to go get one or to buy one. But yeah, I have seen one from Chile that would just fit into a cigar box. So we're talking about a tooth like this big.
Did you say opalized?
Opalized, yes. The last one I saw sell was a 5.5 incher that went for $10,000, and that was 9 years ago. I would suspect the biggest one would go more like 30 to 40,000. It was opalized. And for me, it's irrelevant because they don't do anything for my research. Because basically you've lost all the details that are interesting for my research. can't measure serration size or anything like that. So, yeah, those are beautiful. Yeah, you can have it.
Well, if you find one you don't want.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Someone put it on an auction for a couple of clubs.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, if I find one, I'll put it up in auction for the museum and see what it goes
That's
for.
too much work, just call me. I'll do that.
I'll provide a cigar box.
That sounds like a deal and a half. Other questions? Oh, and by the way, we're having storms starting tomorrow.
Not necessarily along the Calvert Cliffs, but in between
Uh-huh.
that. Say, up in Monmouth County, New Jersey.
Uh-huh.
It's cretaceous, they're
Uh-huh.
reflected in the stream.
Uh-huh.
Any ideas on sorting strategies to help things like get sorted by size?
Same thing, they get sorted by size. So what you're going to look for, you're going to look in the fast water. So you go out after a big rainstorm, after the stream has come back down, and you're going to find the slow areas, the pools are going to have silty bottoms. Yeah, you don't want to look there, but the riffles are going to have gravel and cobble bottoms. The cobble, the bigger the teeth, because they'll sort by size just like they do on the cliffs. Yep. Water is our friend.
Thank you very much.
All right, welcome, glad to do it.
Amazing job.